No, not like that. And not even close. Gossipy women in the Middle Ages looked like this. Women accused of gossiping or arguing were placed in a wooden punishment device that looked like a violin.
The shrew's fiddle was one of those punishments, a simple wooden or metal collar, but one with a cruel design. It locked two people together, face to face, with no way to escape each other. This device was often used for those who wouldn't stop fighting, neighbors, siblings, or, more commonly, women accused of gossiping or arguing too much. Their wrists and necks were locked into the fiddle, trapping their hands in front of them like they were holding an invisible violin. And that was the worst part. With their hands bound, there was no way to push each other away, no way to stop the uncomfortable closeness. They were forced to stand side by side or directly facing each other, for hours or even days, with only one option: talk it out or endure the unbearable awkwardness of their silence. The weight of the device made even small movements difficult, so fighting wasn't an option. It was a punishment based on irony. If two people argued too much, they were forced to spend even more time together, unable to escape their own words.
You're watching Infinity, and today you'll dive into a shocking journey through history. From medieval torture to the madness of ancient Rome. The cruelest inventions of mankind, the darkest laws, and brutal entertainments. Get comfortable and let's go!
Some punishments relied on fire, others on steel. But this one used something even more unpredictable: water. It didn't break bones or leave lasting wounds, but it could terrify, humiliate, and leave a person gasping for breath. The ducking stool was a punishment designed to make sure its victims suffered under the weight of both their crime and the water beneath them. It looked almost like a chair, but not one meant for comfort. A wooden seat, mounted on a long beam, usually placed near a river or pond. A person, often someone accused of gossiping, scolding, or being a public nuisance, was strapped in, completely helpless. Then with a sharp pull, they were plunged into the water. The first few seconds were just shock. The icy water rushed in, filling the nose and mouth before they were yanked back up. But relief never lasted long. A few desperate gasps of air, a moment to process what had just happened, and then another drop. Again and again they were submerged, each time staying underwater a little longer, each time growing more exhausted, more panicked. This punishment wasn't about pain, it was about fear. The fear of not knowing when the next plunge was coming. The fear of not getting enough air before being dragged down again. The fear of not coming back up at all. The people watching might have laughed, jeered, even cheered. But to the person in that chair, the minutes felt endless. Some punishment devices were as much about fear as they were about suffering. Few things struck terror like the Iron Maiden, a tall, coffin-like structure lined with sharp spikes on the inside. It wasn't designed for a quick punishment. It was meant to trap its victim in a tight, enclosed space, making every small movement a mistake. The idea was simple. A person was placed inside, standing upright, and the heavy doors were shut. The spikes weren't meant to pierce deeply, just enough to discourage movement. Trapped in the darkness, with no room to shift, every breath had to be measured, every twitch calculated. Unlike other devices which worked through force, this one used stillness as its greatest weapon. The more a person struggled, the worse it got. Though the Iron Maiden is often associated with medieval Europe, many historians believe it was more of a legend than a widely used punishment. But that didn't stop people from fearing it. The mere idea of being locked away, completely surrounded with no way out, that alone was enough to make it one of history's most infamous devices. But while the Iron Maiden kept its victims standing, locked in place, the next device forced them into a position that was just as unbearable. And instead of sharp spikes, it used gravity as its weapon. There have been many ways to punish speech throughout history, but few were as direct and humiliating as the brank, also known as the scold's bridle. This metal mask wasn't designed to restrain movement, it was designed to silence. A metal cage shaped to fit tightly around the head, with a thin, flat plate that pressed against the tongue. Once locked in place, speaking became impossible. Any attempt to talk resulted in sharp pain, and even breathing could become difficult. It wasn't just the physical discomfort that made the brank so cruel, it was the public nature of the punishment. Those forced to wear it were often paraded through town. Their crime, usually gossip, public outbursts, or insulting someone of higher status, announced to the people around them. The brank wasn't just about stopping speech, it was about making sure everyone knew that speech had been stopped. It was a device of humiliation, designed to make sure the lesson lasted long after the mask was removed. Some versions had additional metal spikes inside, pressing against the tongue or cheeks if the wearer tried to move their mouth. Others had bells attached, ensuring that everyone knew when the person was approaching. There was no hiding it, no escaping the silent message it sent. But while the brank was meant to silence, the next device did something completely different. It wasn't about speech, it was about shame. And instead of trapping the head, it trapped the entire body inside a punishment that left no dignity behind. Some punishments were about suffering, others were about humiliation. The drunkard's cloak fell squarely into the second category. It didn't cause direct harm, but it turned the offender into a walking joke, making sure that their mistake was seen, laughed at, and remembered. It was a large wooden barrel with holes cut out for the arms and head, worn like an oversized, ridiculous coat. A person caught drunk in public, especially repeat offenders, would be forced to wear it and walk through town, stumbling under its weight while people pointed and laughed. The real punishment wasn't the discomfort, though the weight and awkwardness of moving in the barrel made every step a struggle. The real punishment was being turned into a spectacle. People threw insults, children laughed, and former drinking friends suddenly pretended they had never seen the person before. A night of bad decisions became a full-day reminder of why it had been a mistake. For many, this was enough to stop them from drinking to excess again. For others, it only made things worse, driving them further into their habits out of sheer embarrassment. Either way, once someone wore the drunkard's cloak, they were unlikely to forget it. But while this punishment forced a person to carry their own shame, the next device took that idea even further. It didn't just weigh them down, it locked them in place, making every moment feel heavier than the last. Some punishment devices were large and intimidating, designed to make a person suffer the moment they were placed inside, but others were much smaller, almost unremarkable at first glance. The thumbscrew was one of these, a simple device, made of metal, small enough to fit in a pocket yet capable of delivering some of the worst localized pain imaginable. It worked with a basic but cruel mechanism. A person's thumbs, fingers, or even toes were placed between two flat metal plates. Then, with each turn of the screw, the plates pressed tighter and tighter, crushing whatever was inside. The pressure started light, just enough to be uncomfortable. But with each twist, the pain increased. The worst part was how precise and controlled the device was. It wasn't fast and it wasn't unpredictable. The person watching decided exactly how far it would go, how much pressure was applied, and when, or if, it would stop. There was no sudden snap, no unexpected break, just a slow, steady force that wouldn't stop until it was loosened. Some devices looked terrifying just by their design, and few were as unsettling as the pair of anguish. A cold, metal object, shaped like a blooming flower, but with a purpose that had nothing to do with beauty. It wasn't designed to crush or cut, it was designed to open. The mechanism was simple. When closed, the pair of anguish was small, easy to insert into the mouth, throat, or even other body openings. But then, the screw was turned, and the device began to expand. The metal petals slowly widened, stretching whatever space they were inside. Unlike the thumb screw, which focused pressure in one place, this one pushed outward in every direction at once. At first, it just created a feeling of pressure, something unnatural and impossible to ignore. But the more it expanded, the worse it became. Jaws locked open until the muscles burned, throats pressed against their limits, and internal tissues were stretched far beyond what they were meant to handle. Despite its fearsome reputation, there's little evidence that the pair of anguish was widely used. Some historians believe it was more of a threat than an actual device of punishment. But whether or not it was truly put into action, its design alone was enough to make it one of history's most unsettling creations. While the pair of anguish was meant for silence, the next device focused on something very different. It wasn't about causing pain, it was about humiliating those who made the wrong kind of noise. There were punishments for thieves, for liars, and for people who wouldn't stop talking. But what about musicians? In medieval Europe, even bad music could be punished, and the flute of shame was made to make sure no one ever forgot their mistakes. It looked like an oversized metal flute, but it had no use as an instrument. Instead, it was a punishment collar, shaped like a wind instrument, locked around a person's neck. The musician's fingers were placed inside metal rings, forcing them to hold the flute as if they were about to play it. But there was no music, just the mockery of the crowd. The punishment wasn't physical, though the heavy metal collar made every movement difficult. The real suffering came from public humiliation. The condemned were paraded through the streets, forced to wear the instrument they had failed to master, while onlookers laughed and jeered. In some cases, they were even forced to perform their silent shame, a cruel joke that left their reputation in ruins. The flute of shame proved that sometimes the worst punishment wasn't pain, but being made a laughingstock. And no device in history embodied that idea more than the next one, a punishment so simple yet so effective that it was used for centuries to keep society in check. There was no escaping the stocks, not physically, not mentally, and certainly not socially. A person locked inside was trapped, exposed, and completely at the mercy of the crowd, and that was exactly the point. Unlike other punishment devices which relied on pain, restriction, or physical suffering, the stocks focused on humiliation. A person's feet, and sometimes hands or head, were locked into a wooden frame, leaving them in a position that made even simple movement impossible. They were placed in a public space, right in the center of town, where everyone could see them. The punishment wasn't just the discomfort of being stuck in an awkward position for hours. It was about the loss of dignity. The crowd didn't just watch, they participated. People threw food, mud, insults, whatever they could find. Some laughed, some scolded, some even got violent. And the person in the stocks? They could do nothing but endure it all, waiting for the sentence to end. It was simple, effective, and widely used across Europe and colonial America. No blood, no broken bones, just complete and utter embarrassment. For many, a day in the stocks was more than enough to change their behavior forever. Some punishments were brutal, others were psychological. And then there were those that relied on positioning alone to make every second worse than the last. The Judas cradle was one of them, a triangular wooden structure designed to make sitting down the worst possible choice. It worked like this. A person was lowered onto the sharp, pyramid-shaped seat, their body forced into an unnatural posture. At first it may have seemed manageable, but that feeling never lasted. The longer they remained there, the more the weight of their own body worked against them. Their legs trembled, their muscles burned, and any attempt to shift only made things worse. Unlike devices that crushed, stretched, or pierced, this one relied entirely on gravity. There were no chains pulling in opposite directions, no heavy restraints, just a person's own weight, pressing down in a way the body was never meant to handle. It wasn't a fast punishment. Instead, it was a slow, creeping discomfort that grew worse with time. Every second spent on the Judas cradle was a test of endurance, a battle between exhaustion and control. But while the Judas cradle forced people into stillness, the next device did something different. It wasn't about pain at all. It was about humiliation, control, and making sure two people who hated each other had no choice but to face their problem together. There were many punishments throughout history designed to break a person's spirit, but few did it in such a slow and calculated way as the Spanish donkey. It looked simple at first glance. A long wooden beam, shaped into a sharp triangular wedge, standing on sturdy legs. But this was no ordinary bench. This was a device designed to make every passing second feel worse than the last. A person placed on the Spanish donkey was made to straddle the sharp edge like it was a saddle. At first it may not have seemed unbearable, but then came the waiting. The sharp beam pressed harder and harder into the victim's body under their own weight. The longer they sat, the more the pain increased. In some cases, additional weight was tied to the victim's ankles, pulling them down and making the experience far worse. What made this punishment especially cruel was the way it turned time into an enemy. There was no sudden impact, no quick suffering. Instead, the body slowly gave in to the relentless pressure. The muscles tensed, the legs shook, and the sharp edge pressed deeper. The longer the person endured it, the harder it became to sit still. Any attempt to shift, to find relief, only made things worse. This punishment was used in different places and time periods, often in military settings as a form of discipline. It was not meant to be quick. It was meant to test patience, endurance, and the breaking point of both the mind and body. Some were left sitting for hours, others for much longer depending on the severity of their punishment. Not all punishments were about pain. Some worked in a different way, turning every moment into a struggle, making the simplest tasks impossible. The Chinese Kang was one of those punishments. It didn't tear flesh, break bones, or leave permanent scars. But it trapped people in their own bodies, making them suffer through exhaustion, shame, and sheer helplessness. A Kang was a large wooden board with a hole in the middle, locked around a person's neck. It was so wide that they couldn't reach their own face. That meant no eating, no drinking, and no wiping away sweat or insects. Everything required outside help. The board itself was heavy, sometimes weighing over 30 pounds, turning each step into a battle against gravity. It wasn't about physical pain, but about the slow grind of time. Sleep was nearly impossible. There was no way to rest comfortably with a wooden plank restricting movement. The real cruelty came with how long someone was forced to wear it. Some endured it for a few hours, others for days. The longer they wore it, the more unbearable it became. The body weakened from hunger, dehydration, and lack of sleep. The neck and shoulders throbbed from carrying the weight. But worst of all was the humiliation. Those wearing a kang were often left in public, fully exposed to the stares and laughter of strangers. Some had messages carved or painted on the wood, announcing their crime. A thief, a liar, a traitor. But if the kang trapped people in one place, the next device did the opposite. It didn't restrict movement. It forced the body to move in ways it was never meant to, until something gave out. Of all the punishments ever created, few inspired fear like the rack. It was infamous, legendary, and designed to do one thing: pull the human body apart, little by little, until it could take no more. This wasn't just about discomfort. It was about pushing the limits of what a body could endure before it broke. The setup was simple, but devastating. A long wooden frame with rollers on either end. A person was laid down, wrists and ankles tied with rope. Then the rollers turned. At first it was just tightness, then it became pulling, then stretching, and then something far worse. The shoulders popped, the muscles tore, and joints strained past their natural limits. Every small turn of the wheel made it worse, and the worst part, there was no way to stop it. Even before permanent damage was done, the feeling alone was terrifying. The sensation of being stretched apart, completely unable to fight back, was enough to break even the strongest. The body wasn't designed for this kind of force. Some never walked properly again, some lost function in their arms, others were left in twisted, unnatural positions, permanently damaged by the strain. The rack was more than just a machine. It was a slow, calculated test of human limits. A punishment that didn't rely on sharp edges, hot metal, or crushing weight, just the unbearable pressure of a body being pulled in opposite directions, inch by inch. And while the rack worked by stretching a person to their breaking point, another device did the exact opposite. It didn't pull, it didn't stretch, it crushed. And it did so with just as much precision. If the rack worked by stretching, this device did the opposite. It compressed. It forced the body inward, folding a person into themselves until breathing became difficult, limbs went numb, and the pressure became unbearable. This was the scavenger's daughter, a device that proved pain didn't have to come from sharp objects or brutal strikes. Sometimes, it was enough to simply crush a person under their own weight. It looked deceptively simple, just a series of iron bars forming a loop. But once a person was locked in, the real horror began. The victim's arms were forced behind their back, their knees pulled up against their chest, and their head pushed forward. Then, the metal frame was tightened. The body was trapped in an unnatural position, muscles strained, ribs pressed against lungs, and blood circulation cut off. At first it was just uncomfortable, but the longer someone was trapped, the worse it got. Breathing became shallow, limbs started to go numb. The pressure inside the body increased so much that some people reportedly bled from their nose and ears. Unlike the rack, which worked by pulling things apart, this device crushed everything inward, turning the body into its own source of suffering. The scavenger's daughter was not fast. It worked through slow, constant compression, until the body couldn't take anymore. A test of endurance just as cruel as being stretched apart. But while this device folded people in on themselves, the next one did something far worse. It shattered them completely. There were punishments designed to humiliate, some meant to frighten, and others created to destroy a person completely. The breaking wheel belonged to the last category. It didn't just injure, it didn't just punish, it pulverized the human body, leaving behind something barely recognizable. It started with a simple wooden wheel, large, sturdy, built to last. A person was tied to it, their limbs stretched across the spokes. Then came the real horror. Each blow shattered another part of the body, turning solid limbs into nothing but useless fragments beneath the skin. This wasn't fast, the strikes were measured and deliberate. Too quick and the person might lose consciousness, too soft and they might not break properly. The worst cases didn't end with broken bones alone. The breaking wheel was designed to make a person feel every second of their punishment. It wasn't about quick pain or sudden impact, it was about slow destruction, about being left in a state where nothing worked, nothing moved, and yet, consciousness remained. But while this device turned people into lifeless husks, others worked in a different way. Some punishments didn't rely on pain at all. Instead, they relied on humiliation, turning a person into a laughingstock for the whole town to see. Some punishments didn't need pain to be effective. They worked by breaking a person's reputation, turning them into an object of mockery, making sure their name would never be forgotten, but for all the wrong reasons. One of the most infamous of these punishments was the pillory. It was a simple wooden frame with holes for the head and hands. Once locked in place, the person was trapped, unable to move, unable to protect themselves from whatever came next. And what came next was never good. The crowd gathered. People shouted insults. Some threw food, rotten fruit, eggs, whatever they could find. Others weren't so kind, launching stones or filth instead. Unlike other punishments, the pillory didn't end in injury, at least not officially. The device itself didn't break bones or cause suffering, but that didn't mean it wasn't brutal. The real pain came from time, standing there for hours, exposed to the heat, the cold, the rain, unable to shift or even scratch an itch. And then there was the shame, knowing that everyone saw you as a criminal, knowing that even after you were released, the memory would never fade. Some who endured the pillory were never quite the same. Some became outcasts, unable to return to normal life. Others faced injuries, not from the device but from the crowd. In some cases, the public turned violent, throwing more than just insults. And when that happened, there was no escape. The pillory wasn't about destroying the body, it was about destroying a person's dignity, and for many, that was a punishment far worse than pain.
From the horrors of the Middle Ages, we'll move to an earlier time, ancient Rome. I'll tell you about its hidden, cruel, and dark side that people rarely talk about. You've probably heard that the Romans enjoyed banquets. But what they served at those feasts, that's a different story. Roman cuisine, especially for the elite, was all about indulgence. And honestly, the stranger, the better. The weirder the dish, the more luxurious it was considered. They ate dormice, not mice that wandered into their kitchens. These were farmed specifically for eating. Fat, plump, and roasted with honey and poppy seeds, they were a prized delicacy. Flamingo tongues, peacock brains, jellyfish, and sow's wombs were also on the menu for the high and mighty. The Romans didn't waste much either. They loved dishes made from blood, organs, and animal leftovers. One favorite ingredient was garum, a fermented fish sauce made from the guts of anchovies and mackerel left to rot in the sun. It was poured over nearly everything, from meat to desserts. Think of it as the ketchup of Rome, if ketchup smelled like a mix of vinegar and dead fish. And it wasn't just about flavor. The dining experience was often theatrical. At elite banquets, animals might be brought out alive and butchered in front of guests, or dishes would be presented in strange shapes, like pies with live birds inside. It was dinner and a show often designed to shock or impress. For poorer Romans, food was simpler: grains, bread, beans. But for the elite, the goal was to show off wealth by going to culinary extremes. While modern fine dining might include truffle foam or edible gold, ancient Roman food pushed limits in ways that would make even a daring foodie hesitate. In ancient Rome, using the toilet wasn't a private matter, it was a public event. Literally, large communal latrines lined with stone benches had holes cut into them, and people sat side by side, chatting while doing their business. There were no dividers, no stalls, and certainly no flushing mechanism. Just open holes above a flowing water channel, usually carrying away waste to the nearest sewer, or sometimes just to the street. And the cleaning method? That's where it gets even more uncomfortable. Instead of toilet paper, Romans used a communal sponge on a stick, known as a tersorium. Everyone dipped the same sponge into a water channel, wiped, rinsed, and placed it back for the next person. No sanitizers, no soap, just water and hope. Archaeologists believe these sponges were likely soaked in vinegar or salt water to keep them clean, but let's be honest. By today's standards, that's far from reassuring. The strange part? This wasn't just for the poor. Even wealthy citizens sometimes used public latrines when out and about. Some of these facilities were even decorated with mosaics and artwork to lighten the mood, because apparently, sitting inches from someone else wasn't awkward enough. And it wasn't just the conditions that made these places unsettling. Romans believed in bathroom spirits. Yes, you heard that right. They left little offerings or carvings in latrines to appease potential demons or ghosts lurking in the drains. Some even scratched protective symbols into the stone to keep themselves safe from whatever they thought was watching from below. So the next time you're annoyed by a dirty gas station restroom, just know, it could be worse. In Rome, you'd be shoulder to shoulder with strangers, sharing a sponge and hoping nothing grabbed you from beneath. When most people think of gladiators, they picture powerful warriors like in Gladiator or Spartacus. But the truth behind the armor is far darker. Most gladiators weren't heroes. They were enslaved people, prisoners of war, or criminals forced into deadly combat for the entertainment of others. And they didn't have a choice. Trained in special schools under brutal conditions, these fighters were treated more like property than people. Some were lucky enough to gain fans and sponsorships, which could offer slightly better food or gear. But the goal remained the same: to survive long enough to keep the crowd cheering. The Colosseum wasn't just a stadium, it was a blood-soaked theater. Spectators showed up in the tens of thousands. Senators, merchants, and ordinary citizens would pack the stands, waving thumbs to decide if a man lived or died. Sometimes the contests were to the death, sometimes they were rigged, and sometimes exotic animals were released just to add chaos. Lions, leopards, and even elephants were pitted against humans, often with little chance of survival. What's even more shocking is that some Romans considered these games educational. They believed watching people face death built character and reminded them of Roman strength. It wasn't just entertainment, it was ideology. A few rare gladiators earned enough fame to buy their freedom, but most never saw it. Their names were forgotten, but their suffering helped shape one of the empire's most iconic spectacles. And while the armor looks impressive in movies, the reality underneath was chains, fear, and a fight for survival that wasn't nearly as glorious. The Romans were ahead of their time in many ways, but in one tragic twist, their clever plumbing may have helped poison an entire civilization. Their water system was advanced for the era, with aqueducts carrying fresh water into cities and homes. The problem: much of that water flowed through pipes made of lead. Lead, of course, is highly toxic, but Romans didn't know that. They used lead not just for pipes, but in cooking pots, cosmetics, paints, and even as a sweetener in food and wine. When their wine turned sour, they didn't toss it. They added a special syrup called sapa, boiled down in lead pots. The result was a sweeter, smoother drink, and a silent dose of heavy metal. Scientists today believe lead exposure was widespread in the empire, especially among the wealthy. Studies of Roman skeletons show elevated lead levels in bones. Some researchers even suggest that chronic exposure might have affected behavior and decision-making in the ruling class. Ever wonder why some emperors acted so irrationally? This might have been one of the hidden reasons. Of course, not everything in Rome contained lead, and not everyone was affected equally. But the sheer amount used in everyday life makes it clear. What the Romans thought was innovation turned out to be dangerous. Their impressive infrastructure may have looked clean and modern, but behind the marble and fountains, toxic metal flowed quietly through their veins. Forget daggers in the back if you wanted someone out of the way in ancient Rome. You served them dinner. Poisoning wasn't just a sneaky tactic. It was practically a political tool. In the Senate, in the palace, even at elite banquets, alliances shifted based on what was in the wine glass. Some of Rome's most powerful figures met their end not on the battlefield, but at the dining table. Empresses, senators, and servants all had access to substances that could slip into a drink without a trace. Some were plant-based, others were mineral or animal-derived. A few were said to mimic illness so closely that no one would suspect foul play. There were even rumors of poison schools' private tutors who taught how to extract venom from rare plants or mix powders that worked slowly over time. Servants could be bribed to add just a touch of something extra to a cup of wine. And if you didn't die outright, you might fall ill long enough to miss a crucial vote, opening the door for someone else to rise. Even Rome's legal system wrestled with the issue. Poisonings were often hard to prove, and accusations flew wildly, especially during power transitions. Some emperors lived in constant paranoia, hiring food tasters or switching meals at the last second to avoid betrayal from within their own households. This silent method of elimination became a dark trademark of Roman politics. Trust was rare, ambition was everywhere, and the most dangerous weapon in the empire might not have been a sword. It was the second sip of wine. Not all Roman emperors were tyrants, but when they went off the rails, they took the whole empire with them. Some ruled with charisma and reform. Others, they turned the palace into a stage for their delusions, and the citizens paid the price. Caligula is one of the most infamous. He declared himself a living god, made his horse a high-ranking official, and held lavish feasts where guests were never quite sure if they were eating or about to be eaten. One day, he'd reward someone with gold. The next, he'd sentence them for sneezing too loudly. Then there was Nero, who fancied himself an artist more than a ruler. He forced senators to attend his musical performances, sometimes for hours. When a great fire tore through Rome, many claimed Nero watched it burn from his tower, playing his instrument and singing about destruction. He later blamed the tragedy on a minority group and launched brutal crackdowns to deflect blame. Commodus took things even further. Obsessed with gladiators, he fought in the arena himself, carefully staged, of course, so he'd always win. But his violent fantasies bled into his rule. He renamed months after himself, demanded to be worshipped like Hercules, and executed advisors for questioning his new titles. These weren't harmless quirks. Under their reigns, the empire teetered, resources were wasted, public trust collapsed, and fear became the only currency in court. Rome's system, built on order and discipline, became a playground for madness, and the further an emperor drifted from reality, the more dangerous daily life became for everyone else. In ancient Rome, slavery wasn't hidden, it was embedded in everything. From the grand marble villas to the bustling markets, enslaved people were the engine that kept the empire running. They weren't just farm workers or house servants. They were accountants, teachers, cooks, construction workers, and entertainers, many of whom had no rights and no hope of freedom. Unlike in modern times where slavery is universally condemned, in Rome it was viewed as completely normal. A wealthy Roman might own dozens or even hundreds of enslaved people. Even average citizens often had at least one. They were bought, sold, punished, and inherited like property, not treated as people. Some were captured in war, others were born into servitude, and a few ended up enslaved due to debt or legal trouble. Treatment varied widely. Some were given a decent life with the chance of eventual freedom. Others lived under constant surveillance, violence, or worse. There were no laws protecting them from mistreatment, and a master could discipline them, however they liked sometimes, as a warning to others. Despite their condition, enslaved people kept the empire functioning. They built roads and aqueducts, staffed the imperial palaces, and even served in the private households of senators. Ironically, some were more educated than their owners, especially those brought in from other advanced regions of the Mediterranean. And although a handful could earn or be granted freedom, the system itself was a trap. Even freed individuals often remained in the shadow of their former masters, tied by law and reputation. Slavery wasn't the exception in ancient Rome, it was the rule. It shaped the economy, the culture, and the daily rhythm of Roman life in ways that are impossible to overlook. Ask someone what they picture when they hear ancient Rome, and chances are public baths come up. Giant marble rooms with heated pools, columns, and steam? Yes. But what doesn't get mentioned is the fact that these places were also giant reservoirs of grime, bacteria, and questionable behavior. Romans visited the baths daily. It wasn't just about getting clean, it was a social ritual. People exercised in the palaestra, got oiled down, and scraped their sweat off with a curved tool called a strigil. Then they soaked in a series of pools ranging from cold to hot, often without actually washing with soap first. Whatever they scraped off, oil, dirt, dead skin, often ended up in the water. There was no chlorine, no filtration system. The water was occasionally changed, but with hundreds of bodies going through every day, you can guess what those pools were really like. And since the floors were wet and slippery, accidents were common. Add in poor lighting and echoing acoustics, and you've got a recipe for chaos. The baths weren't just steamy hangouts. They were hotspots for gossip, pickpockets, and sometimes more adult encounters tucked into side rooms. While philosophers praised the baths as places for relaxation and community, satirists often mocked them as loud, dirty, and full of pretentious conversations. Despite all this, Romans loved them. Admission was cheap, even free on holidays. And for many, it was the only chance to access warm water and some kind of hygiene. Just don't think of them as ancient spas. They were more like a mix of a gym, public pool, and marketplace with a whole lot of body odor thrown in. In ancient Rome, crime didn't always lead to prison, but that didn't mean offenders got off easy. Punishments were often immediate, brutal, and meant to send a clear message: step out of line, and you pay, sometimes with your flesh. The justice system was sharply divided. A Roman citizen accused of theft might get a fine or public humiliation. But if you were enslaved, poor, or foreign, the consequences could be much harsher. Flogging, branding, forced labor, or exile were common. For serious theft or repeated offenses, the penalties ramped up fast, sometimes involving mutilation or forced fights in the arena. Even minor things like disrespecting a local official or cheating in the marketplace could land someone in hot water. And since trials weren't always fair, it often came down to who you knew or how much influence you had. A powerful person's word could outweigh hard evidence. Public punishment was often designed for spectacle. Stocks and whippings were carried out in forums or markets, where crowds could watch and talk. The goal wasn't just to punish the individual, it was to make sure everyone else got the message. Some emperors and governors became infamous for using over-the-top penalties to control unrest. There were cases of entire groups being punished for one person's mistake, and laws that seemed designed more to intimidate than to keep order. Roman law laid the groundwork for many legal systems today, but their methods were far from gentle. In a world built on strict hierarchy and public obedience, justice wasn't always blind. It was often ruthless. Roman culture wasn't shy about its myths, and yeah, many of those stories went far beyond what modern audiences would call PG. One of the most striking examples lies in their statues, mosaics, and pottery, where humans and animals were sometimes shown in shockingly close encounters. It wasn't just symbolism. These images reflected deeper ideas from their mythology and rituals. Take the myth of Leda and the swan. The story tells of Jupiter, the Roman version of Zeus, taking the form of a swan to seduce or overpower a woman. Versions of this tale were painted, carved, and told in Roman homes for centuries. Another well-known story involved Europa and a bull, again, Jupiter in disguise. These weren't hidden in temples or restricted to scholars. They were out in the open, part of everyday visual culture. To Roman eyes, these scenes weren't necessarily obscene. They were divine stories, tangled with ideas of power, transformation, and desire. But modern viewers can't help but raise an eyebrow. Some surviving artworks go even further, showing creatures part human and part animal in intimate situations that suggest these myths weren't just metaphor. They shaped the Romans' understanding of identity and sensuality. What's more, these images weren't tucked away in adult-only areas. They were found on household items, murals, and even in public bathhouses. Their world didn't draw the same lines of acceptable as ours. To them, the line between man, beast, and God was far more flexible, and their art shows it in vivid, unapologetic detail. In Rome, not everyone got a start in life. While families celebrated the birth of children, there was a chilling rule woven into the social fabric. A newborn's life didn't truly begin until the father accepted it. If he chose not to, the child could be exposed, a polite term for abandoning them outside the city or near a trash heap. Financial hardship, lack of space, illness, or simply being born at the wrong time. And though it sounds horrifying today, this was a socially accepted practice in ancient Rome. It wasn't done in secrecy. It was part of the norm. Some temples and shrines even had specific places where infants could be left. Occasionally, these children were taken in by others, sometimes raised as servants or, if fortunate, adopted. But many weren't that lucky. Roman law didn't consider this a crime, and philosophers of the time openly discussed when and why it was acceptable. It's a part of Roman life that rarely gets shown in movies or TV series, but it shaped the way families functioned and how society operated. The empire valued strength, order, and utility, traits that didn't always leave room for vulnerability or unpredictability. Even in matters of life, pragmatism often won over emotion. In the Roman world, violence wasn't hidden, it was center stage. What many civilizations would consider punishment or cruelty, Rome turned into spectacle. Public executions, brutal beatings, and staged deaths weren't just justice. They were events people lined up to watch. The Colosseum is the most famous arena, but it wasn't alone. Amphitheaters across the empire held deadly games. Some featured professional fighters, but others used condemned criminals in much more gruesome roles. These people weren't there to compete. They were brought out to be executed in creative, dramatic ways. Sometimes it was by wild animals, other times by staged mythical scenes where they played the victim. One reenactment might involve a man dressed as a mythological figure who was then torn apart by trained animals, as a way to retell ancient stories through live death. It was a mixture of theater and horror show, but to the Roman audience, it was both thrilling and socially acceptable. Even in smaller venues, torture was a part of public life. For those lower in the social order, especially enslaved people, confession under pressure wasn't just common, it was expected. Roman law even required that certain testimonies be extracted through physical force to be considered valid. It's easy to forget that this was a society that saw pain differently. They viewed endurance as a mark of honor and suffering, as a way to maintain control. It wasn't about hiding violence. In many cases, they elevated it to art. In Rome, personal freedom wasn't a guarantee. It was a privilege that could vanish overnight. The empire was built on control, and if you weren't part of the ruling elite, Your life could be redirected, restricted, or ended with a single order. Loyalty mattered, but usefulness mattered more. Citizenship provided some protection, but even then, the state could conscript you into the army, confiscate your property, or exile you without warning if you angered the wrong person. Trials were public, fast, and often biased. The higher your status, the better your chances. For everyone else, it was survival by obedience. If you were enslaved, the state didn't see you as a person. You had no legal identity. If your owner died or was punished, you might be sold, split from your family, or simply forgotten. Even freed individuals, liberty, lived under the shadow of their former masters and had limited rights. Roman infrastructure was impressive, but it served the state first. Roads were built to move legions. Cities were designed for surveillance and order. Entertainment, like the games, wasn't just for fun. It was used to distract and control the public. Even religion was tied to political power. The emperor wasn't just a ruler, he was seen as a living link to the gods. The message was clear: you were part of the machine. And if that machine needed to replace you, it wouldn't blink. There were always more workers, more soldiers, more citizens. Life in Rome had its rewards, but safety wasn't one of them unless you were at the top. Write in the comments, would you want to find yourself in ancient Rome after learning about its darker side I just mentioned? Next, we'll move to more recent times, the 19th and 20th centuries. You'll discover the crazy laws that existed not so long ago by historical standards. From arsenic in clothing to the selling of people, yes, it was actually legal. When the U.S. Postal Service introduced parcel post in the early 1910s, Americans quickly got creative. It didn't take long for someone to ask if I can send a sack of potatoes across state lines. Could I send my child? Turns out the answer was yes. At least for a brief, bizarre moment in history, you could legally mail a child as long as they weighed under the 50-pound limit. The most famous case happened in 1914, when a couple in Idaho mailed their young son to his grandmother's house. He wore a coat with stamps sewn onto it and was handed over to a postal carrier like any other package. The carrier didn't just drop him at the door, he personally delivered the child to grandma, right on schedule. Newspapers covered it like a quirky story, and no one involved got in trouble. Other families followed. It was cheaper than buying a train ticket, and rural postmen were often neighbors anyway. These weren't boxes with holes poked in the top. The children usually sat in the mail car, accompanied by adults under full supervision. Still, it pushed the limits of what parcel meant. Eventually, the Postal Service realized things had gone a bit too far. By 1915, the Postmaster General had to officially ban the mailing of people, no matter how well-behaved they were. Today, it seems impossible, but back then it was just one more way the mailman delivered more than just letters. In today's world, driving under the influence means, flashing lights, strict penalties, and those public awareness campaigns we all see. But honestly, not that long ago, it was just another night on the road. For most of the 20th century, driving after drinking wasn't just common. It was actually completely legal in a lot of places. There were no breathalyzers, no legal limits, and no enforcement. In the 1950s and 60s, bar parking lots were packed. Folks would leave pubs and diners, climb behind the wheel, and cruise home without a second thought. Some even kept a flask in the glove box just in case. And when accidents happened, it was often brushed off as just bad luck or poor weather. Law enforcement usually had no tools to test anything, and honestly, many officers just looked the other way. It wasn't until the 1980s that the conversation really started to shift. Advocacy groups began pushing for laws that addressed what was actually happening on the roads. That's when things changed. Blood alcohol limits were introduced, sobriety checkpoints became legal, and education campaigns rolled out. But look, the shift didn't happen overnight. In fact, some states took years to implement consistent laws. Today, it's hard to even picture someone sipping behind the wheel with no consequences. But for decades, it was all just part of the drive. Seatbelts were optional, open containers were common. And unless something really serious happened, the law didn't say much. It was a different kind of road trip, one that rolled on for way too long without rules. In the heart of world fairs and museums, long before the age of ethical tourism or cultural sensitivity, there were these exhibits that honestly shocked no one at the time, but would horrify us today. They were called ethnological displays, but let's be real, what they really were just were human zoos. Entire villages were reconstructed to showcase people from Africa, Asia, or the Pacific Islands, placed behind fences and put on display like living museum pieces. Dressed in traditional clothing, asked to perform dances or daily routines, these individuals were shipped across continents and told to act natural in front of gawking crowds. Visitors would line up to stare, take photos, and compare notes. A lot of folks believed they were learning something, but what they were really witnessing was cultural exploitation dressed up as entertainment. The 1889 World's Fair in Paris included a full-scale replica of a native village populated by real people brought in from French colonies. In Germany, Karl Hagenbeck, the guy known for modernizing animal zoos, also managed one of the largest human exhibits, placing people in enclosures that mirrored jungle or savanna settings. Even the Bronx Zoo once featured a man from Central Africa in its primate house. The public saw these events as educational. Officials praised the realism. But as global understanding evolved, these displays faded, replaced by museums focused on artifacts, not people. Still, the photos and records remain, a stark reminder of a time when culture was caged and curiosity crossed every line. Long before safety labels, choking hazard warnings, or child-proof packaging, the toy aisle was honestly a wild place. Some of the most popular toys from the mid-20th century weren't just dangerous, they were truly risky. Take lawn darts, for example. These foot-long, steel-tipped projectiles were meant to be tossed across the yard toward plastic hoops. One wrong throw and, well, someone could end up in the emergency room. They were banned decades later, but not before causing thousands of injuries. Then there were dolls filled with asbestos. That soft, fluffy insulation inside cuddly toys? It was made from a fire-resistant material now known for its severe health risks. At the time, it was praised for its durability and safety, which is pretty ironic, considering its long-term effects. Toy companies advertised it proudly, totally unaware of what it could do over time. And the crown jewel of jaw-dropping childhood science? The Atomic Energy Lab. Sold in the early 1950s, this educational kit came with a Geiger counter, cloud chamber, and real uranium samples. Yup, actual radioactive materials. It promised kids a peek into atomic science and gave them a kit that wouldn't stand a chance under today's regulations. All of these products were sold legally, often with bright packaging and glowing reviews from parents and educators. Safety standards? Still in development. The toy industry was focused on thrills and innovation, and for a while that meant pushing boundaries way beyond what's allowed today. What's now banned, recalled, or kept in museums was once the hottest item on every holiday wish list. In the 1800s, if you wanted to show off wealth and taste, you covered your home in green. Not just any green, a deep, vivid hue that shimmered in gaslight. It was fashionable, elegant, and deadly. The secret behind that color? Arsenic. Chemists had discovered that combining copper and arsenic created a pigment so brilliant it became the color of choice for everything from dresses to curtains to nursery wallpaper. The problem? That beautiful pigment could release toxic particles, especially in damp or poorly ventilated spaces. People started falling mysteriously ill in rooms decorated with the trendy green. Headaches, rashes, and respiratory issues followed. Yet for years, doctors and manufacturers denied any connection. After all, how could something so stylish be harmful? It wasn't just wallpaper. Dresses, artificial flowers, even book covers used the same pigment. Some factory workers who handled the dye developed strange symptoms, and in a few high-profile cases, entire families suffered health problems without knowing why. Still, there were no regulations stopping its use. Eventually, suspicions mounted and studies began pointing directly to the arsenic-laced dye. But even then, removing it from the market took time. There was no formal ban, just a gradual fade as awareness grew. Today, collectors still come across books and wallpapers with that dangerous green shimmer, a beautiful design hiding a toxic past. In the 1940s and 50s, medicine took a sharp turn into territory that sounds more like a psychological thriller than actual history. Lobotomies, a procedure involving the severing of brain connections, were introduced as a cutting-edge solution to all kinds of emotional and behavioral conditions. But what started as a treatment for severe mental illness quickly expanded into something else, a quick fix for anxiety, stress, or simply not fitting in. And the people most often targeted? Women, especially housewives. Back then, if a woman was seen as too emotional, too withdrawn, too outspoken, or even just overwhelmed by the pressures of domestic life, doctors sometimes recommended this invasive procedure. It involved inserting a sharp instrument near the eye and disrupting key brain circuits. The goal was to calm the patient, but the results often left people dulled, distant, or disconnected. Still, it was legal, and at its peak, lobotomies were performed by the thousands in hospitals across the United States. One of the leading figures behind the movement even drove around the country in a van performing the procedure in clinics and mental institutions, like a traveling salesman of brain surgery. It was seen as progressive, endorsed by medical boards, and even earned a Nobel Prize. The troubling part is how loosely the definition of needing help was applied. A woman could be described as too nervous or uncooperative, and that alone might be enough. Husbands or family members sometimes signed the paperwork. Consent wasn't always clear, wasn't. The practice was treated as modern science, not something dangerous. By the 1960s, new medications began replacing these surgeries, and public opinion started to shift. The procedure faded from mainstream use not through a ban, but because it simply fell out of favor. But the fact that it was once legal, widespread, and even encouraged shows just how much medicine and society's view of women's behavior has changed. It's hard to believe, but not too long ago, it was completely legal to send a child barely tall enough to reach a shovel deep into a coal mine. In late 19th and early 20th century America, coal mining wasn't just for rugged men with lanterns and pickaxes, it also relied on kids. Small, fast, and considered cheap labor, boys as young as 8 were hired to crawl through tight, dangerous tunnels. Their job? Pull coal carts, pick rocks from conveyor belts, or open and close ventilation doors underground for 10 hours straight. These children were called breaker boys and trappers. They worked surrounded by black dust so thick it stuck to their lungs and skin. Coal dust filled the air like fog, and explosions weren't uncommon. Miners called some shafts coffin mines, and yet this was a job passed down through families, just part of life. Parents often signed their kids up willingly because it was one of the few available ways to earn steady money in struggling communities. Photos from that era show children covered in soot, eyes barely open from exhaustion, standing next to carts taller than they were. And this wasn't just in one region. From Pennsylvania to West Virginia, coal towns thrived on these tiny workers. There were no federal rules, no inspections, no child labor protections. The law turned a blind eye. Many mining companies even built housing and schools near the pits, though school hours were a luxury most kids couldn't afford. In the 1910s, reformers like Lewis Hine began photographing these boys to shock the public. His images circulated in newspapers and magazines, stirring public outrage. It took decades of pressure before any real change happened. The Fair Labor Standards Act, which finally set a national minimum age for work in hazardous jobs, didn't come into force until much later. Back in 18th and 19th century England, getting a divorce wasn't just difficult, it was nearly impossible. It required an act of parliament, which meant money, influence, and time that most working-class families didn't have. So, some men came up with a workaround that sounds completely made up. But wasn't they sold their wives at public markets? Literally. With a rope tied around her neck, waist, or wrist, the woman was walked to a town square and auctioned off to the highest bidder, often with a crowd watching like it was a weekend fair. It was supposed to be symbolic, not cruel. The idea was that both parties agreed the man no longer wanted to be married, and the woman often already had a new partner lined up. In fact, some of these sales ended with a handshake, a pint of beer, and the woman happily walking away with her new husband. Authorities usually looked the other way. There were even cases where the new couple got official recognition, not punishment. This practice wasn't limited to small villages either. It happened in cities like London, Birmingham, and Leeds. Newspaper reports from the time described these sales in surprising detail, including how much the woman was bought for. Sometimes it was a few shillings. Other times it was more of a trade, like exchanging her for livestock or beer. Though it may sound shocking now, this was a kind of public performance rooted in frustration with the legal system. Eventually, laws began tightening and public opinion shifted. But for nearly a century, selling your wife with a rope in the market square wasn't just a joke, it was a real legal option. There was a time when flying meant clouds outside the window and clouds inside the cabin. For decades, smoking on airplanes wasn't just allowed, it was practically expected. Ashtrays were built into every seat. Flight attendants handed out free packs of cigarettes with meals. Even pilots smoked in the cockpit while cruising across the Atlantic. The idea of breathing recycled smoke for hours was simply normal. In the early jet age, lighting up mid-flight was part of the glamour. Flying was for the well-dressed, and so was smoking. Airlines even used tobacco brands in their advertisements. But by the 1970s, things started to change. Cabin crews and health experts raised concerns about the air quality on board. Passengers who didn't smoke were stuck inhaling a fog of secondhand smoke from takeoff to landing. Still, regulations were slow to come. It wasn't until the late 1980s that smoking bans were introduced, and only on short domestic flights at first. Long-haul and international flights? Still fair game. The shift didn't fully settle until the early 2000s, when smoking was finally banned from nearly every commercial flight worldwide. Today, most passengers don't even realize what that little no smoking sign used to mean. It's just always been off. But if you ever wondered why the ashtray is still there in some plane bathrooms, that's because legally there has to be one, just in case someone breaks the rule. A relic of an airborne era when lighting up at 30,000 feet was just part of the journey. In the late 19th century, one particular white powder had a sparkling reputation. Doctors, pharmacists, and even parents totally swore by it. It was mixed into everything from pain relief ointments to cough syrups. One of the most popular uses? Toothache drops. They promised fast relief, and yeah, they definitely delivered. Kids with sore gums were given medicine that numbed the pain instantly and, oddly enough, left them feeling pretty energized. At the same time, soft drinks were booming. Inventors were busy creating fizzy concoctions for pharmacies, marketing them as health tonics. And that's where Coca-Cola comes in. The original recipe, yes, the real one included coca leaf extract, which is a natural source of that same popular white powder. It gave the drink its name, its reputation, and, well, its signature kick. Back then, nobody thought this was weird. In fact, it was considered modern, even scientific. Ads described these substances as invigorating, stimulating, and just perfect for people feeling run down or overworked. It wasn't until decades later that researchers started linking long-term use to some pretty serious health problems. Coca-Cola quietly removed the coca element in the early 1900s, although some forms of coca extract are still legally used in flavor production, minus the substance itself. As for those toothache drops and energy elixirs, they disappeared once regulations finally caught up, leaving behind a legacy of glowing ads, wide eyes, and a soda that went from pharmacy tonic to global icon. Today, even getting behind the wheel for the first time means, paperwork, eye exams, and a road test that can make your palms sweat. But there was a time not that long ago when none of that was required. In the early 1900s, all across America, you could just buy a car, hop in, and take off. No license, no proof of age, no training. If you could reach the pedals and turn the wheel, that was good enough. Cars were still a novelty back then, and lawmakers just hadn't caught up with the chaos they could cause. Actually, the first traffic laws in the United States weren't even about licenses, they were about horses getting spooked by engines. By the 1910s, as cities filled with Model Ts and untrained drivers, accidents really skyrocketed. But enforcement? Still pretty minimal. Some states didn't even introduce driver's licenses until the 1950s. South Dakota, for example, held out until the late 50s, and even then, the test was optional. In those early days, driver education just wasn't a thing. Parents taught kids by, letting them loose on country roads. Cities were more like real-life bumper car arenas with no traffic signals and no standard signs. Insurance companies started ringing alarm bells, but change came slowly. There's even a famous case of a 13-year-old boy in the 1920s who drove his entire family across several states without raising a single eyebrow. Police waved at him as he passed. Why? Because there was no rule saying he couldn't. Some towns issued local permits, but honestly, they were more like receipts than actual licenses. You paid a small fee, got a stamped card, and that was it, official enough. It took decades and, unfortunately, a lot of rising fatalities before standardized testing, photo IDs, and age limits became the norm. What's now a rite of passage used to be as easy as buying a loaf of bread. And for a while, the open road really was open to anyone. Back in the 1700s and 1800s, if someone insulted your honor, there was actually a legal way to handle it by, shooting them at dawn. Dueling wasn't just some dramatic plot twist from a costume drama. It was real law in many parts of the world, especially in Europe and early America. And it came with rules: same type of weapon, equal ground, and witnesses. It was considered refined, a gentleman's way of saying, let's settle this ourselves. Politicians, poets, military leaders, Even United States Vice President Aaron Burr took part. In fact, he famously dueled Alexander Hamilton in 1804, a moment that still echoes through history and, Broadway. Both men arrived with seconds and pistols, ready to do what the court system couldn't. It wasn't considered murder if both parties agreed and followed the dueling code. Dueling grounds were often just outside city limits to avoid legal trouble. Doctors were on standby, spectators came to watch. And although the idea sounds wild now, duels were taken seriously with elaborate etiquette, like choosing weapons and pacing steps. In some cultures, refusing to duel was actually seen as worse than losing. Over time, governments started clamping down, especially as these battles often ended in, permanent consequences. Still, dueling laws weren't fully removed from the books in some places until surprisingly recently. In Paraguay, it's technically still legal under certain conditions. The concept of settling things like a man? It once came with a very real countdown and a loaded pistol. Not that long ago, the line between justice and spectacle was razor thin. Public executions weren't hidden behind closed prison walls, they were front-row events, complete with food vendors, musicians, and packed crowds. From England's gallows to France's guillotine, executions were treated as community happenings. People dressed up, brought their children, and claimed the best viewing spots as if it were a parade. In 19th century London, a major execution could draw tens of thousands of spectators. Some climbed rooftops, others sold souvenir pamphlets with dramatic headlines. In France, the guillotine was considered clean and efficient. Even as late as the 1930s, executions happened in full view of the public, just steps away from cafes and corner shops. The US wasn't much different. In 1936, a public hanging in Kentucky brought out over 20,000 people. Local newspapers printed the time and location like it was a sporting event. And it didn't end when the sentence was carried out. Some attendees stuck around to grab pieces of rope as grim keepsakes. Eventually, laws shifted and executions were moved out of sight. Privacy became the norm. But the fact that entire towns once gathered for these events shows how different public values were. What we now see as the most solemn act of justice was once something you packed a lunch to watch. In the mid-1900s, especially across traveling carnivals and daredevil shows, there was one act guaranteed to pull a crowd stunts performed by pregnant women. Yes, it really happened, and it was completely legal. These performances were advertised like thrilling headliners designed to shock and amaze. "The high-flying mother," one banner declared. It was part danger, part spectacle, and part marketing genius. Photos and posters from the time show women in circus outfits doing motorcycle jumps, tightrope walks, or standing atop cars racing through flaming hoops, all while visibly expecting. The audience reaction was always the same: gasps, cheers, and lines around the block. In some cases, the performers weren't just participating, they were the stars of the show, promoted on flyers and newspaper ads. There were no regulations stopping them. If anything, the attention these acts brought in was welcomed. Carnivals made big money, and these stunts sold tickets. Safety standards? Practically non-existent. And although the risk was real, the public fascination overrode the concern. It was the era of shock value and big banners, and these shows delivered exactly that. Today, the idea sounds unthinkable, like something from a satire or a wild movie subplot. But during that golden age of roadside entertainment, these stunts were just another part of the traveling thrill machine, and no one thought twice about it. That's about it. Which of the currently legal things do you think will become illegal in the future? Write in the comments. For more useful information, watch other videos.